That healer isn't going to want anything from you. The man behind the trading post counter said it without looking up from the ledger he was annotating, his pen still moving across the page, as if the statement were no different from noting the price of a bag of oats. He had the manner of someone who had worked a counter long enough to have heard most human intentions before they were fully explained, and who had formed his opinions of those intentions early and saw little reason to revise them. Emmett Rance stood on the other side of the counter and said nothing for a moment. The trading post smelled of cured leather and cedar, and the faint sweetness of dried goods stored in burlap, and the afternoon light was coming in through the single west-facing window at an angle that caught the dust in the air and made everything in the room look as though it was slowly settling. Emmett had ridden 4 hours to get here. He had left the ranch before first light, come down through the lower pass with his roan, a horse named Cutter, who had an opinion about early mornings that he expressed mostly through the angle of his ears, and arrived in Salt Creek just after midday with enough time to speak to the man at the counter and then get back before dark, if the conversation didn't take long. "I'm not looking for his approval," Emmett said. "I'm looking for something worth bringing." The man with the pen, his name was Pratt, and he had run the Salt Creek trading post for 11 years, finally looked up. He was a compact man with a face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild skepticism, the kind that came not from a suspicious nature but simply from long exposure to the gap between what people said they wanted and what they actually did with it once they had it. He studied Emmett for a moment. Emmett was not a difficult man to read. He had an honest face, the kind of face that reported what was happening inside it whether he intended it to or not. And what was happening inside it right now was a quiet, steady determination that Pratt recognized from the category of things that were going to happen regardless of his input. "He's camped on the north side of Arroyo Banta," Pratt said. "The wide part, where the cottonwoods bunch up. He comes through this stretch every couple of years. Has for as long as anyone around here can remember." He paused and turned to a shelf behind him, scanning with the practiced eye of someone who knew where everything was without having to look for it. "You want the willow bark compound or the dried root mix from the valley?" Emmett put his last coin on the counter. It was a single coin, worn smooth on one face, and it made a quiet sound when it landed. If this kind of story is something that holds your attention, subscribing to the channel takes a single second, and it helps more than you might think. Pratt looked at the coin, and then at Emmett, and then back at the coin, and there was something in his expression that went briefly past skepticism into something more careful. He did not comment on it. He reached for the willow bark compound. To understand what brought Emmett Rance to that counter on that particular afternoon, and why the choice of what to bring mattered to him more than it would have mattered to most people, it helps to know something about the year he had been having. Not the broad shape of it. That was the same shape as the years a lot of ranchers in the territory had been living through, the kind of year where the spring came late and dry and the grass never fully caught up to where it needed to be, and every calculation you made in winter turned out to have been 3 weeks too optimistic. The specific shape of Emmett's year had more to do with the east pasture fence, which had come down in the early thaw and let 17 head drift into the draws to the northeast, and with the fact that finding them had taken 10 days and 2 of them had not been found at all, and with the subsequent calculation, done at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening with a pencil stub and a sheet of paper that he later folded and put in his coat pocket rather than leaving where it could be seen. That had shown him exactly how far the year's losses had gone, past what he had available to absorb them. The coin he put on Pratt's counter was not a figure of speech. It was what it was. The ranch itself, the Rance property, 41 acres on the eastern slope above the Banta drainage, had been his father's before it was his, and his father had come to it the way people came to land in that territory, which is to say through a combination of persistence and timing that subsequent generations tended to remember as something more intentional than it actually was. Emmett had grown up on that slope. He knew the way the afternoon shadows moved across the lower pasture in late summer, knew where the soil went from loam to clay, knew which part of the upper fence got the worst of the southwest wind, and needed checking every March. He knew it the way people know the place where they are from, not just informationally but physically, in the body, the kind of knowing that sits in the hands and feet and doesn't require thought. He had never seriously considered leaving, not even in a year like this one. Cutter was tied at the post outside the trading post when Emmett came back through the door with the paper-wrapped compound in one hand. The roan turned his head at the sound of the door and regarded his rider with the unhurried attention of a horse who has been standing long enough to get comfortable and is not entirely sure he approves of this development. Emmett tucked the package into the saddlebag, checked the cinch out of habit, and stood for a moment with one hand on the saddle while he worked out the direction in his head. North side of Arroyo Banta, the wide part where the cottonwoods bunch up. He had heard about the healer the way he heard about most things that happened in the territory beyond his own immediate range. From partial reports and second-hand accounts that arrived in no particular order and required some assembly before they made any kind of sense. The first account had come from a neighbor named Joss Farwell, who ranched the drainage below Emmett's, and who had mentioned, at the feed store in Mira Creek 3 weeks prior, that there was an Apache healer camped on the north side of the arroyo, and that several people from the valley had gone to him with various complaints and come back largely satisfied. Joss said this the way he said most things, factually and without editorial, as if the information was simply a feature of the landscape that it seemed useful to note. Emmett had filed it away. The second account came from a woman he knew slightly, the wife of one of the Oldgate brothers who ran cattle in the flats to the south. She had more detail. She had actually gone to see the healer herself, she said, for a persistent joint inflammation that had not responded to anything the town doctor had offered. And after 2 visits, she had experienced a reduction in pain that she described with the careful restraint of someone who is aware that the claim sounds improbable and does not want to oversell it. She said the healer was old and spoke limited English, but communicated through a young man who sometimes traveled with him and spoke both languages. She said he was deliberate. She said he did not ask for payment. That last part was what stayed with Emmett. The healer did not ask for payment, which meant that what he received came from whatever people brought on their own judgment. And Emmett had been thinking, over the 3 weeks since he first heard about this, about what a man like that might actually need. Not what you could hand him as a token of gratitude, but what might be genuinely useful. A man who traveled. A man who carried knowledge in his head rather than in possessions. A man who worked in remedies and compounds. Medicine made sense. It was something you could use up. Something that diminished with use and needed replenishing. And if Emmett didn't know exactly what the right compound was, Pratt did, because Pratt had been selling things to people in this territory long enough to know what had a history of working and what was wishful thinking in a paper packet. The willow bark compound had a history of working. Emmett untied Cutter, swung up, and turned north. The man who was the subject of all of this, the Apache healer, whose camp Emmett was now riding toward with a paper-wrapped package in his saddlebag and an honest face that reported his intentions clearly whether he meant it to or not, was not having a complicated morning. His name was Dasan, and he had been awake since before dawn, as he usually was, sitting outside the low shelter he had made at the edge of the cottonwood stand, and watching the sky go from black to dark grey to the particular pale shade that arrived in the 20 minutes before the sun actually appeared above the eastern ridge. There was something in that transition, the precise quality of that light, neither dark nor day, that Dasan had been watching for most of his 62 years, and he had not yet come to the end of finding it worth watching. His people knew him as someone who had been paying attention for a long time. This was, in certain traditions, part of what made a healer. Not the knowledge of which plants did what, that was learnable, had been learned by many, but the quality of attention brought to the observation. Plants changed with season and elevation and the specific quality of the ground they grew in. A remedy that worked in one valley did not automatically work the same way in a valley 3 ridges away. The healer, who did not know this, who carried a fixed list of compounds and applied them uniformly regardless of where he was working from a map of a country he had never actually walked. Dasan had walked most of this country. He had been doing so for 40 years, moving through the territory in the patterns that made sense to him. Patterns shaped by the rhythms of what grew where and when, by the slow migrations of the plants themselves as conditions shifted year to year, by the locations of the people who might need what he knew. He was not traveling with the young interpreter on this particular circuit. The young man, his name was Sibo, and he was the son of a cousin, had stayed north for the season, and Dasan was making do with the English he had, which was functional if not fluent, supplemented by the occasional willingness of people to slow down and speak plainly, which was more common than people in towns expected. People who needed help were generally willing to communicate in whatever way worked. The fire he had made that morning was small, just enough to heat the clay pot he used for preparing the tinctures he worked with daily, and it had burned down to a low, steady heat by the time the sun cleared the ridge. He was working at the preparation when he heard the horse, and he looked up and saw the rider coming along the arroyo's north edge from the direction of Salt Creek. A lean man on a roan horse, moving at an easy pace, not rushing. The horse had good feet. Dasan noticed the way it placed them on the uneven ground along the arroyo bank, careful and unhurried, with the particular steadiness of an animal that trusted its own judgment. He watched the rider come. Emmett saw the smoke first, a thin, pale thread rising from the cottonwood stand about a quarter-mile ahead. And then, as he got closer, the low shelter and the fire and the figure seated beside it. He reined Cutter to a walk and came in slowly, giving the camp time to register his approach, which was the basic courtesy of the territory and required no particular thought. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped. The man by the fire was not what Emmett had been picturing, though he couldn't have said exactly what he had been picturing. He was older than Emmett had expected, somewhere in his 60s, with a face that had the particular quality of having spent decades in outdoor light, all the surfaces weathered in different directions until each angle caught the morning differently. He wore a plain linen shirt, worn smooth at the elbows, and a leather vest that had been repaired in 2 places with a stitch that was slightly different in color from the original. His hands, which were resting on either side of the clay pot he was tending, were the hands of someone who worked with them, not roughly but constantly, with precision. He was watching Emmett with an expression that was not guarded and not open but simply attentive, the way you watch something when you have not yet decided what it is. "Good morning," Emmett said. Dasan nodded. "Name's Emmett Rance. I ranch the east slope above the Banta drainage, about half a day's ride south." He paused. "I heard you were camped up here. I brought something." He reached back and worked the package from the saddlebag and held it where it could be seen. "Willow bark compound, from the post in Salt Creek. I thought, for whatever you might need it for." Dasan looked at the package in Emmett's hand. He did not reach for it. He looked at it the way a man who knows what a thing contains looks at the packaging around it, reading the shape and the weight and the way it was wrapped, gathering information before committing to any reaction. "Get down," he said. His English was careful and deliberate, each word placed with the attention of someone who has learned to choose them specifically. "Water for horse, come." Emmett swung down and tied Cutter at the nearest cottonwood, where there was good shade and a slow seep of water along the base of the bank that the roan immediately found and approved of. He walked to the fire with the package still in his hand. What happened next took him somewhat by surprise, not dramatically, not in a way that made him step back or change his expression, but in a quiet, internal way, the way surprises do when they arrive without spectacle and simply require you to revise what you thought you knew. Dasan took the package from Emmett's hand, set it on the flat stone beside the fire, and began unwrapping it with the methodical care of someone who reuses paper and intends to fold it neatly when he is done. He held the compound inside, a small folded cloth containing the dried and ground material, and brought it close to his face and inhaled, unhurried, through his nose. He turned it in his fingers. He pressed it gently between thumb and forefinger to test the texture. Then he set it down on the stone next to the wrapper and looked at Emmett with an expression that had not changed in quality, still attentive, still patient, but that now contained something additional that Emmett could not immediately name. "Good," Dason said. He touched the compound with one finger. "This, good compound. Real bark. Pratt's." Emmett nodded. "Pratt has good things." Dason paused and looked at the compound for a moment. "Expensive?" "It's fine," Emmett said. Another pause. Dason looked up at him. The particular quality of the attention he gave was not the same as most people's attention. It was slower and more complete, as if it included things that ordinary-looking did not. He looked at Emmett's hands and at his boots, and at the angle of his shoulders, and at the horse tied at the cottonwood. And when he had finished this quiet inventory, he looked at Emmett's face again. "How much?" he asked. Emmett said nothing for a moment. "Your last," Dason said. It was not a question. There was a silence. The morning was very clear and still. Above the cottonwood canopy, a pair of ravens were moving slowly east along the ridge, their wing beats deliberate and wide-spaced, saying nothing to each other or to anything below. Emmett felt something shift in the air of the conversation, not uncomfortably, but in the way air shifts before a change in weather, a pressure adjustment that alerts the body to something coming before the mind has processed it. "You don't need to worry about that," Emmett said. "I'm not worried," Dason said. "I'm telling you I won't take it." He folded the cloth carefully and rewrapped it in the paper with the same methodical care he had used unwrapping it, and set it on the stone between them. He looked at Emmett without apology or softness, but with the frank directness of someone stating a thing that seems to him perfectly clear. "A man who gives his last coin," Dason said, "gives too much. I don't want too much." Emmett looked at the package and then at Dason and had nothing immediate to say. He was not a man who experienced silence as something that needed filling. He had ranched alone long enough to have made peace with quiet. But this silence had a particular quality that he was not sure how to navigate, because it wasn't the silence of a conversation that had ended. It was the silence of a conversation that had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated and was now waiting for him to follow. "I'm not giving it as payment," Emmett said finally. "I'm giving it as I thought you might need it." "I know what it is," Dason said. He reached behind him and pulled forward a narrow basket, the kind woven tightly enough to hold dry goods without leaking, with a fitted lid that pressed down rather than lifting off, and set it on the stone beside the returned package. He opened it and looked inside for a moment, not searching but considering, in the way you consider a cabinet whose contents you know well and are deciding among. He selected 3 small tied cloth bundles, each about the size of his fist, and set them out in a row on the flat stone. "Sit," he said. Emmett sat on the ground across from him. The fire between them had gone down to coals, and the clay pot above it was producing a slow, faint thread of steam. Dason picked up the first bundle and held it where Emmett could see it. "Arroyo grass root," he said. "Dried. This one," he touched the bundle gently at one end, "for the joints, for stiffness in cold weather, steep in hot water, 1 small cup before morning work." He set it down and picked up the second. "This, canyon mint and dried bark of the gray willow, not the brown. This one is for the chest, when the cold goes in and stays." He set that one down and picked up the third. It was slightly smaller than the others and tied with a different cord, a red cord, faded but still distinguishable. "This one for the horse." Emmett looked up. "Rowan has the left front going stiff," Dason said. "Not bad yet, but starting." He held the bundle with the red cord. "Pack of this in water, warm. Soak the hoof and the fetlock, 20 minutes, twice a week until you see the heat go out of it. You'll see the heat there now if you put your hand on it. Emmett said nothing. He had not mentioned Cutter. He had not mentioned anything about the horse. He turned and looked at Cutter, who was standing with the roan patience of a horse that has found good water and adequate shade and is making the most of both. The horse's left front was resting at a very slight cant, barely visible, the kind of angle that you only notice when you have been told to look for it. He turned back to Dasan. Left front, Emmett said quietly. Started this autumn, Dasan said. I think. Emmett had noticed the horse favoring it slightly on the rocky sections of the trail coming down through the pass that morning. He had not connected it to anything specific. It had seemed like the ordinary complaint of a working horse on uneven ground, the kind of thing that resolved with a day of rest, and came back the following week, and eventually you started keeping half an eye on it without calling it anything in particular. How did you? He came to the water carefully, Dasan said. The right front finds the ground first, a small thing, but a horse that is comfortable finds both fronts the same. He pushed the 3 bundles across the stone toward Emmett. The paper-wrapped compound sat between them, still folded, still on Dasan's side of the stone. Take these, Dasan said. Leave that one. He nodded at the compound. Pratt sells willow bark to many people. I have enough. You spent what you had, so take these and use them. And bring back the basket when you come through this way again. The instruction about the basket was the thing that stayed with Emmett afterward. Not the medicine, not the observation about Cutter, not even the refusal itself. The instruction about the basket implied that Dasan expected to be in this territory again. That he would be passing through the same arroyo in some future season that was not yet specifically defined, moving along the same patterns he had always moved along, and that Emmett would be on the east slope above the Banta drainage when that season came, going about the work of the ranch, and that on some morning in that future time it would be reasonable to bring back a basket. It implied, in other words, that both of them would still be here. For a man who had spent the past month doing arithmetic that pointed in a different direction, the implication landed with the quiet weight of something that refuses to be argued with. He took the 3 bundles and placed them carefully in his saddlebag, folded in the cloth he used to wrap small things. He checked Cutter's left front with his hand, pressing gently along the fetlock and up toward the cannon, and found what Dasan had described. A warmth that sat deeper than the surface warmth of a horse who had been standing in morning sun. Not painful to the touch. Cutter did not flinch, but present, a low heat that had the character of something that had been building slowly and had not yet become a problem but was practicing for it. He put his boot in the stirrup and swung up. Dasan had returned to the clay pot and was adjusting the heat from below with a small stick, coaxing the coals into a more even distribution. He did not look up. Thank you, Emmett said. Come back with the basket, Dasan said, still looking at the fire. Emmett turned Cutter south, back along the arroyo's north bank, toward the pass and the long slope down to his 41 acres, and the fences that needed mending, and the east pasture where 17 head had drifted and 15 had come back. The morning was fully open now, the sun clear of the ridge and the arroyo bright, with the particular clean light of mid-morning in the early dry season. The cottonwood leaves catching and releasing it in slow, silver-backed turns. He rode at a walk, which was partly consideration for Cutter's left front and partly something else. A quality of unhurriedness that had settled over the morning and that he was not yet ready to leave behind. The paper-wrapped compound was still on the stone at the fire when he rounded the first bend and the cottonwood stand closed behind him. He did not think about it in terms of what had been given or not given. Whether he had lost something or gained something or broken even in the accounting of the morning. That kind of accounting was the habit of a certain kind of worry, and he had spent enough of the past month in its company to recognize it, and to know that it did not have much to tell him that he didn't already know. What he thought about instead, Riding south with the 3 bundles in his saddlebag and the warmth of Cutter's left front still faintly on the palm of his right hand, was the instruction about the basket. The simplicity of it. Come back with the basket. He had no idea when Dasan would be through again. Next season, possibly, the one after. The patterns of such traveling were not the kind that operated on calendars, but the instruction had been given as if the timing were not the point, as if what mattered was only the fact of returning, and the when of it was a detail that the territory would arrange in its own time. Emmett found he had no quarrel with that. He held Cutter to the walk all the way to the pass. The roan's ears were forward and easy, taking in the morning. The left front moved carefully over the rocky sections, but it moved, steady, considered, doing the work. At the top of the pass, where the trail opened up, and the whole south-facing slope unrolled below them in its late-season brown and ochre, Emmett stopped and looked out at the drainage, and at the distant dark line of his upper fence, and at the smaller dark line of the ranch buildings below it. The sky above the ridge was a deep, clear blue, the kind that only comes after the first cold of the autumn has pushed the haze out and left the air as clean as it gets. Below him, the land was quiet. He sat on the horse at the top of the pass and took it in for a moment, then he went down. Cutter improved through the winter. The twice-weekly soaks took 20 minutes each time, and the roans submitted to them with the resigned patience of a horse who has learned that some human activities are not worth arguing about. And by the second month, the heat in the left front had gone out and had not come back. Emmett used the first bundle for his own joints through the January cold and found the results consistent with the old gate woman's careful description. Not dramatic, not a cure, but a reduction that was real enough to notice and that he was grateful for in the early mornings when the temperature had dropped hard overnight and the first hour of work was the most difficult. He kept the basket on the shelf near the kitchen door, where he would see it regularly, which was where he kept the things he was waiting to return. In the spring, he went back. Dasan was not at Arroyo Banta. It was not yet the right season for that section of his circuit, Emmett calculated, and he had not expected him to be. But the following autumn, when the days shortened and the cottonwoods went gold, he heard from a woman at the Mira Creek store that the healer had been seen coming through the valley again. Emmett brought the basket down to Salt Creek that week. He left it with Pratt, with a note that said only his name and the return. The same coin, replaced in full, with the compound inside. Pratt passed it along on his own next trip north. What Dasan did with it, if anything, no one came back to report. But the basket went, and the thing it carried went, and on the east slope above the Banta drainage, a roan horse moved through the winter on 4 good feet, and the man who rode him went out to work on the fence lines every morning in the cold, with joints that cooperated well enough to get the work done, and neither of these things seemed small. If this story landed with you, leave a comment. It means more to this channel than you might think, and the next story is already waiting. The upper fence held through that winter and the next. In spring, when the thaw moved through the drainage and the lower pasture came back green, Emmett went out to check the third post from the south corner, the one that had been giving him trouble since the freeze heaved the ground 2 years back, and found it solid. He pressed it with both hands, and it did not move. He stood there for a moment with his palms flat against the wood, feeling the solidity of it, the way it had set itself back into the ground and decided to stay. He left it where it was,